Brothers and sisters, welcome back to the Son of the North podcast. I am your host Rex, serving as your guiding light through the darkness of this age. A week has gone by since this project began, and so far the podcast has seemingly been a great success. It has honestly surpassed all of my expectations. I want to thank you all for the positive feedback and support you have given me over this past week. I promise you that I will do all in my power to make this show meet and surpass all of your expectations. I hope that I can continue to provide you all with a weekly escape from the soul-crushing insanity of the Kali Yuga. Before we start, I've been asked multiple times this week about the song that plays during the intro. It's a pretty catchy little number. I thought it was really perfect to capture the primal, guttural sort of atmosphere that I want to define the show. The song is titled Castel de Montsegur and is part of the Grawl Night musical project. I mean, the whole project gives off really Indo-European vibes. So if you like my intro, I would really suggest checking out other songs from the project. Yeah, for me, this album just captures a perfect blend of the sounds of the Eastern and Western Indo-European religious traditions. You know, say you're listening to this album out loud, like on a speaker. It gives off a really powerful, holy aura. It really permeates throughout the room. You know, sometimes when I'm making a sacrifice, I'll just play it in the background because music has always been a part of Indo-European ritual. I rest my case. This album is just awesome. Zach Jansen is the genius behind this project. And if you want to listen to Grawl Night, you can find it by going on Bandcamp and searching GRAALKNYGHT. That's Grawl Night on Bandcamp. Just like your beloved Uncle Rex, Zach lives in the Great White North and is a practicing pagan. I'm sure most of my listeners would agree with me on this one. I think it is super important that we true pagans help to strengthen our faith in our communities by doing what we can to support and encourage the ambitions of our fellow pagans. If you want to check out some of Zach's other projects, I'll have links to his Instagram page as well as some of his other works in the bio for this episode. Now that we've gotten that housekeeping out of the way, we can proceed onward with today's program. This is episode 2 of Son of the North, and today we will be discussing a topic that I mentioned in the pilot episode. Today, we will be looking at the Hindu epic, the Ramayana. Specifically, we will focus on exploring what makes this story such a good reflection of our ancestral Indo-European traditions and values. Furthermore, I'm going to share some of my thoughts on the potential value of this epic as a semi-historical account of our ancestors' expansions and conquests into the Indian subcontinent. My esteemed listeners, grab your bow, recite some protective mantras, and hop into your chariot. The Son of the North is about to dive into the Ramayana.
O Lord of Lanka, I am Hanuman. I come to you with respect as a messenger of Lord Sugrive, the Ravana king and devoted friend of Ram, Prince of Ayodhya. You know it was a cowardly act to carry off Princess Sita, totally contrary to Dharma. This will surely end in your destruction and the destruction of your race.
This is a quote from a Japanese animated production of the Ramayana that I was watching with my woman the other night, and I think there's a very valuable lesson to be learned here. In this line of dialogue, we can hear Hanuman scold Ravana, the demon king of the island of Sri Lanka, and leader of the demonic race known as the Rakshasas. The monkey god offers the demon king a warning that is just as valuable to us as it was to him. By neglecting our dharma, our spiritual duty as Indo-Europeans, we are helping to seal the fate of our people. Man, that is some powerful stuff. Nothing like a bit of an existential crisis to start off the podcast, am I right? Perhaps the Demon King should have listened to Hanuman, for his hubris and adharma nearly spells the extinction of all of his people. Still confused as to what I'm on about? Don't worry, Uncle Rex has another crash course for you. The Ramayana, translated as Lord Ram's Journey, is the story of the Vedic warrior prince Ram. While Journey is the most direct translation of Ayana, perhaps an alternative translation, Progress, is more fitting, as this translation more accurately reflects Ram's personal transformation over the course of the epic. The great hero Ram, and no, it's not pronounced Rama, was the firstborn son of King Dasharatha of Ayodhya and rightful heir to the throne. Ayodhya was the capital of the beautiful and prosperous Vedic kingdom of Kosala, located in northern India. Ram is the scion of the legendary Solar dynasty, which is believed to be one of the two major founding bloodlines for the Kshatriya caste. Here we can clearly see that the Vedic Indians, who themselves were an offshoot of Indo-European settlers in India, associated ruling and nobility with the sun and its majesty. Ram perfectly encapsulates what it means to be a solar hero, as he is considered to be the ideal man that all Kshatriyas should seek to emulate. In this sense, he is perhaps akin to Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch. From the modern Hindu perspective, Ram is considered to be an avatar, which is one of the great god Vishnu's mortal incarnations upon earth. I won't delve too deep into Vaishnavism, as it is largely a product of post-Vedic Hindu theology. Regardless, Ram's association with Vishnu is quite telling, as it tells us how much he towers over the other Indian heroes. Our story begins not with Ram, but with Ravan. Now, Ravan is quite an interesting character, and he's definitely not as black and white as some might lead you to think. He was born the eldest son of a Hindu sage and a Rakshasa princess. As such, he was born a Brahmin, fitting to the Indo-European priestly caste. As an adult, he became king of the nation of the Rakshasas, and they made their home on the island of Lanka, which we know now as Sri Lanka. While Rakshasa is often translated into English as demon, this is not necessarily the case. Defining what Rakshasas are is kind of complicated, but they're generally considered to be malevolent, human-like beings who harass priests and devour human flesh. At the same time, they can be noble leaders and pious devotees of the gods. Some would say that the Rakshasa could be considered adversaries, which are factions of evil gods or supernatural spirits that oppose the high gods in many Indo-European mythologies. We can think of the Aesir and the Vanir for another comparison, or perhaps the Olympians and the Titans. Ravan is very much the enemy of the Indo-European gods. At the beginning of the epic poem, Ravan and his Rakshasa armies are busy sieging down Svarg, the heavenly kingdom of Indra. Along with being the king of the heavens, Indra is the serpent-slaying storm god with a furious temperament and a love of strong drink and fine women. He obviously has mythological parallels with other manifestations of our Indo-European sky father, particularly with Zeus. Whether or not Indra is a direct manifestation of Dyaus is debatable, considering that the Rig Veda, which is the oldest existing written source of Indo-European history and theology, describes a Dyaus Pitar, who is the heavenly father deity of the sky and consort to the earth goddess. Indra's forces bravely resist Ravan and his demon armies, but are quickly routed after Ravan's son Meghanad defeats and captures Indra. To our ancient Indo-European ancestors, this would have been considered a crisis of cosmic proportions. The Sky Father, the very progenitor of our people and the gods themselves, has been subjugated by a powerful agent of the adversarial evil. Who will bring the reins to earth? Who shall empower our warriors and smite our enemies? The world becomes engulfed in darkness, and mankind neglects their spiritual duty by not making sacrifices to the gods and the ancestors. Chaos has the forces of order in check. The gods appeal to Vishnu, preserver of the universe and member of the divine trinity, to put an end to the invincible demon king's reign of terror. Back on Earth, in the royal city of Ayodhya, the honorable Vedic warrior king Dasharatha desires to have a son. After performing a ritual of sacrifice at the behest of his priest, all three of the king's wives get pregnant. 9 months later, the first wife Kaushalya gives birth to the king's son and heir, Ram, the hero of our story. The other 2 wives give birth to a son and a pair of twin sons respectively. Rama and his 3 brothers have a joyful and eventful childhood without much infighting. For his courage in battle and great deeds in the favor of the gods, King Dasharatha's lineage has been secured. The eldest son and heir apparent, Ram grows up to become an exemplary young man. Ram and his brother Lakshman become excellent warriors, trained in the use of both earthly and powerful astral weaponry by Vedic priests. Their adolescent adventures involve lots of demon slaying and feats of strength. The greatest of these challenges involves Ram accidentally snapping the divine bow of Shiva while trying to string it. For this feat, he's rewarded the lovely hand of Princess Sita in marriage. Sita's importance to the narrative of the Ramayana cannot be understated. She is the daughter of the earth goddess and a beauty without compare. Throughout the story, Sita is described as having a radiant golden complexion to her. Given this description and a number of other reasons, I have come to believe that Sita herself is a manifestation of Hausos, the Indo-European dawn goddess, daughter of Dios and the Earth Mother. You'll hear more on this theory of mine in part 2 of our special 2-part episode on the Ramayana. Ram and Sita fall in love and become inseparable. Both return to Ayodhya and enjoy the palace life. But as is a common theme with Indo-European heroes, we know that life's comforts will have to be abandoned for one to reach their glorious destiny. The old king Dasharatha foresaw in a dream a crisis falling upon his kingdom, and so made plans to crown and transfer power to his young, capable heir Ram. The favored wife of the king, Ram's stepmother, was convinced by her maidservant to conspire against Ram to put her own son, the second eldest, on the throne. As a reward for saving his life in a battle long ago, the king had promised this wife to grant any 2 wishes. She cashed in on these boons, demanding that Ram be exiled and her son made king. So as to uphold the reputation of his dynasty, King Dasharatha cannot reject her wishes. Reluctantly, the king made plans for his second son to become king and exiled Ram south from his kingdom into India's wild forested interior towards Lanka and his destiny. Sita, the loving wife of the young prince, and his devoted brother Lakshman insist that they accompany Ram into the wilds. The wheel of fate had been set in motion. With the unfortunate decisions of his youth coming back to haunt him, King Dasharatha fell horribly ill and died. Bharat, the king's second son, rushed home when he heard of his father's passing, and, having learned of Ram's exile, rushed to invite his beloved brother back home to take the throne. Honoring his dharma as a warrior noble, Ram told his brother Bharat that he had to honor their dead father's last command, and that he would only return to rule after the 14 years of his exile were over. With his brother ruling over the kingdom as regent until his return, our hero Ram lived a peaceful life in the woods with his brother and his wife, hunting and foraging for their meals, slaying demons, and honoring the Aryan gods. Ravana eventually learned of Ram's demon slaying and of Sita's incomparable beauty. He desired the radiant goddess for himself and, using the principal demonic art of deception, separated the divine hero from his wife so that he could kidnap her and flee in cowardice back to his distant island kingdom. Ram and Lakshman had discovered Ravana's plot only too late, and on foot could not keep up with the demon's flying chariot. The 2 brothers journeyed south in the direction of the chariot, slaying demons along the way. It is during this journey south that we see Ram starting to receive aid from a number of different anthropomorphic animal kings. Principal amongst these kings is Sugrive, the usurped king of the Vulneras, who are monkey people. Ram helps to restore Sugrive to his throne, and ever grateful and in accordance with his dharma as a warrior noble, the Monkey King offers Ram command of his massive army to assist in the rescue of the divine Princess Sita. The massive simian army is sent to scour the globe in all 4 directions, but it is ultimately the southern search party that discovers that Sita has been taken across the sea to Lanka. This southern contingent is led by the Monkey King's closest advisors, most notably Hanuman, son of the Vedic wind god and himself the god of strength. A key element of Hanuman's power is derived from his devotion to his true liege, Ram. While he is a monkey, Hanuman's character and values are unquestionably Indo-European. Hanuman also parallels several other Indo-European gods and heroes, but we shall discuss this in part 2 of this special episode. Given his divine parentage, Hanuman has spectacular powers, most importantly, impossible strength and fortitude, the ability to fly, and the ability to change size at will. Hanuman flies to Lanka, defeating a serpent monster along the way, and infiltrates the palace and manages to locate Sita. Sita has been forcibly kept in the flower garden of Ravana's harem, but has otherwise remained untouched due to a curse previously laid on the demon king. Ever faithful to her husband Ram, Sita constantly prays for her husband's safety and hopes that swift rescue is on its way. Hanuman informs Sita that he is a messenger of Ram and that help is on its way. He tells her that she should fear not, for her husband Ram is the scion of the solar dynasty and the greatest of men. Surely it is his duty to rescue her, and he shall not fail in this task. Hanuman himself decides to get captured so that he can meet and warn Ravana, which leads to the exchange we heard at the beginning of this episode. The monkey god eventually escapes the impenetrable island capital, but not before burning much of it down in the process. Hanuman swiftly returns to Ram to inform him of his wife's whereabouts, and the Kshatriya and his army of animal allies prepare for war. The massive army marches south across the Indian subcontinent on the warpath until they reach the strait that separates Sri Lanka from the Indian mainland. Now, during the Vedic Bronze Age, seafaring vessels that could bring an entire army across the strait were pretty much non-existent. So Ram offers a prayer and sacrifice to the Vedic sea god, who in return offers his respects to the noble hero by ensuring that any stone inscribed with Ram's name shall not sink into the sea, but shall instead float. Ram instructs his armies and the nearby animals, who are all but happy to help, to build him a bridge to Sri Lanka by using stones inscribed with his name. The foreign armies that Ram commands are quite literally spreading his name across the sea and building monuments that will immortalize the young warrior forever. The bridge is completed, and Ram and his armies cross over to Lanka and set up their camp outside of the royal capital. After Ravana rejects Ram's final offer of peace by refusing to give up the woman he so wrongfully kidnapped, Ram declares war and presses to attack the palace. Ravana sends the most powerful of his demon commanders to fight, including his son Meghanad, now dubbed Indrajit, which means the conqueror or subduer of Indra. Indrajit is often overlooked in his importance as a villain, but I believe his importance to our understanding of the Indo-European nature of Ram's story is without question. Using trickery, Indrajit is able to mortally wound Ram's devoted brother Lakshman. Now, Ram is a stoic character, but even he has his mortal limits. He is disheartened at the potential loss of his brother, staying secluded away from the battle at his brother's side in the medical tent. Devoting all of his efforts to ensuring that his beloved liege Ram fulfills his destiny, the powerful Hanuman flies all the way from Sri Lanka to the Himalayas, those sacred mountains of Hinduism. It is here that the monkey god finds a special species of herb with intensely powerful medicinal effects. He begins to collect some of these herbs to address the wounded, but he realizes that while he could surely heal Lakshman with the small amount he can carry himself, he would be unable to heal all of the other warriors of Ram's army. To ensure that Ram can rise like the sun and conquer Ravana's darkness, Hanuman achieves the impossible, growing to a massive size and, using all of his strength, ripping the entire herb-covered mountain out of the ground, bringing it with him back to the battlefield. With his brother and entire army back in fighting condition, Lord Ram is ready to save the world and restore his ancestral gods to the heavens. Using his trusty bow and many astral weapons, Ram is able to slay all of Ravana's commanders, brothers, and even his beloved son and heir Indrajit. Driven to act by the death of his kinsman, the near-invincible king of the Rakshasas steps out to fight that adventuring prince and to settle the fate of the cosmos once and for all. The two warriors take part in a spectacular fight, with both heroes soaring through the sky on flying chariots and unleashing terrifying astral weapons upon each other. Ultimately, Ram is able to strike down the Demon King and claim victory, fulfilling his destiny and restoring orders to the cosmos by vanquishing Ravana's great evil. The radiant Sita has a heartwarming reunion with her beloved Ram, and the divine pair physically consecrate their love to honor the occasion. Ravana's only surviving brother, Vibhishan, was a staunch devotee of Ram, and prior to the war pleaded that Ravana yield to the demands of the conquering hero to avoid the destruction of their people. For his devotion, Ram appointed him the new king of Lanka. The monkey tribal armies return home, celebrating their victory in service to the mighty and noble solar liege. King Sugrive is now the master of most of the wilderness of India's southern expanses. Ram, Sita, and Lakshman return home to Ayodhya, their 14-year exile now being at an end. Hanuman returns the holy mountain to the Himalayas, and in a powerful and moving display of loyalty to his liege, physically tears his chest open to reveal that Ram and Sita reside within his heart. The conquering hero Ram is crowned king of Ayodhya, and with the wisdom and power he has gained from his adventures in exile, he leads that Vedic kingdom to a golden age of happiness and prosperity. He and Sita have 2 sons, and there are a number of differing accounts of their lives as rulers of the kingdom. Often these accounts are from later medieval sources and seem to slander the otherwise good character of Ram, so we shall not discuss them here, simply because they tell us very little of the Indo-European ideals and traditions in the story. Now that we've completed the story of the Ramayana, we're going to take a quick break before we dive back into discussion. So, if you've been sitting down this whole time, as I did last week, I'd recommend that you get up and do a bit of stretching. Perhaps go grab a glass of water or, our sponsor, milk. While you're quickly going to get a snack, I'm going to serenade you with some musings from my jaw harp. I clearly still need a lot of practice, but it's just a fun little toy to play with every now and then. It's perfect for when I'm out camping, just sitting by the campfire, just jamming out, really trying to get into that shamanic trance-like state. On that note, you'll be happy to know that the podcast with the Chad Pastoralist will be dropped soon, so keep your eyes and ears open for that. All right. So now we're going to move into the second half of our podcast, and we're going to be discussing whether or not the Ramayana is a semi-historical account of the Indo-European expansion into southern India. With the literary, linguistic, genetic, and archaeological data currently available to us, it is undeniable that Indo-European populations migrated into the Indian subcontinent during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Now, before we go any further, there are many Indian scholars who would reject this theory out of a stubborn determination to ground Vedic religious traditions as being entirely indigenous to India. The only scientific proof for this theory that the Aryans came from India is based upon misapplied studies of linguistics and the flat-out dismissal of substantiated proofs offered by people who actually understand Indo-European history. The arguments used to defend this indigenous Aryan theory are rooted in liberal, post-colonial rhetoric, which basically argues that all evidence for the Aryan invasion is false no matter how substantiated it is because of racist European bias. Of course, when you say that the people that disagree with you are racist, suddenly you don't need to prove anything you believe in. Quite honestly, the liberal rhetoric used to defend this position is especially nonsensical when you consider the theory itself. In short, the Aryan invasion theory proposes that the ancestors of modern Iranic, Indian, and European populations originated from the steppes of Central Asia. Now, what kind of supposedly anti-Indian, pro-European theory would argue that modern Europeans and Indians alike both have the same genetic roots? Doesn't really seem very racist to me. Ironically enough, this indigenous Aryan theory is politically rooted in Hindu nationalist thought, which tries to unite Aryans and Dravidians alike in opposition to the foreign religion of Islam. Much of Hindu nationalist thought emerged in the early 1940s with the support of a certain German chancellor. Now, knowing his thoughts on the Aryan peoples and the Aryan invasion theory, it's almost comical thinking that this political ideology that emerged out of the desire to reignite the Aryan spirit now spits on the very history of their Aryan ancestors. But politics won't help us revive our ancient Indo-European traditions. To do so, we must make use of all of the evidence that our ancestors have left behind about their way of life and their gods. Actual evidence suggests that civilization in India began in the Indus River Valley, which is located in modern-day Pakistan. This civilization was quite advanced for the early Bronze Age, with the cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa having elaborate water supply systems and urban planning. Eventually, archaeology shows that these sites were abandoned and that many burials were hastily made in the upper levels of these cities' archaeological records. Of great interest to scholars of the Aryan invasion, we can determine from the archaeological record that these Indus Valley peoples had metallurgy, but very few weapons have ever been found at Indus Valley sites. Because of this, some people have concluded that the people of the Indus Valley were largely pacifists. Oh man, I'm sure you can all see where this is going. Thanks to linguistic reconstruction, scholars have determined that the language of these Indus Valley peoples most closely resembles the Dravidian languages spoken by the non-Indo-European ethnic groups in southern India. There are clearly some place names in other parts of India and even on the Persian Gulf that have Dravidian linguistic origins. This curiously suggests that these earliest Indians either abandoned their cities and migrated south, or died out in the north with their southern cousins continuing onward. So what could possibly force this drastic demographic change? Well, if you're listening to this podcast, then the answer should be quite obvious. Shortly after the collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization, we begin to see the emergence of Vedic culture in India. This Vedic culture clearly has its roots in Indo-European cultures, as evidenced by archaeology and by textual sources. The Rig Veda, which, as the name implies, was compiled during the Vedic period, is the earliest and perhaps the most important Hindu religious text. It contains hymns of prayer and rituals of sacrifice dedicated to Indo-European deities, including Dyaus himself. Furthermore, the Rig Veda has historical value, listing the names of various nomadic Aryan tribes and describing their conflicts against the indigenous inhabitants of their new land. Indra, whom we briefly discussed at the beginning of this episode, is perhaps the most important god mentioned in the Rig Veda. This makes sense considering that the people who wrote the Rig Veda were Indo-European, and Indra himself is likely a manifestation of Dyaus. These earliest Vedic texts clearly allude to a culture still largely rooted in the steppe lifestyle, with prayers focusing on the protection of pastoral livestock and hymns offering good fortune in battle. The Rig Veda describes many accounts of Indra aiding the Aryan tribes in their subjugation of the Dashas or Dasyas. Several times throughout the Rig Veda, Indra is described as the conqueror of the Dashas, and is known to aid his people by using thunderbolts to tear down those unimpregnable walled cities of the Dasyas. This is possibly an allusion to the walled cities of the Indus Valley civilization. According to the Rig Veda, the Dasyas are described as having dark skin and being smaller than the Aryans. Of more importance to us, the Dasyas are described as worshipping fertility deities that were not part of the Indo-European pantheon. The term Dasyos itself means slave or servant in Sanskrit, perhaps a glimpse of the fate of these subjugated non-Aryan peoples. While some scholars try to argue that the Dasyas were more of a spiritual enemy, the evidence currently available clearly hints that the accounts of Indra and the Aryans' wars against the Dasyas reflect a real historical conflict over cattle and land during the Bronze Age. This conflict was likely against some of the peoples of the Indus Valley, or perhaps their close cousins. If this is the case, then we can assume that the Rig Veda provides a semi-historical account of the migration and conquests of our Indo-European ancestors into the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. This theory is supported by the predominance of Indo-European languages spoken throughout the north of India. Now, this is not to say that the Indo-Europeans conflicted with all of India's indigenous inhabitants. Obviously, the Dravidian people still exist today, so there was no total extermination of the previous inhabitants. Furthermore, genetics suggest that modern North Indians possess both steppe and indigenous ancestry, with increasing prevalence of the latter amongst those belonging to India's lower castes. Higher steppe ancestry is prevalent among the North Indians belonging to the upper priestly and warrior castes. We could reasonably imagine that the Indo-European tribes who invaded India conquered for themselves new kingdoms, promoting their culture, languages, and gods amongst the largely indigenous populace they now ruled over. A fourth caste, that of the laborer, was introduced into the previous tripartite caste system that defined Indo-European society to accommodate the new subjects. However, we know that India's southern Dravidian populations today also have a priestly caste and warrior caste, who, for the most part, are represented as Dravidians genetically. Furthermore, many of these Dravidian Indians still worship Vedic gods in addition to more local deities. Clearly, the situation is more complex than just one series of invasions. Based upon my readings, I propose that the Ramayana could offer us an explanation as to why Indo-European social structures and gods were adopted in southern India, even though no genetically Indo-European populations migrated there. While historical records of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age only survive in our mythos, we can assume that human nature has not changed much since then. Throughout history, there are examples of tribes and sometimes entire kingdoms allying with a powerful newcomer in the region in order to defeat old rivals. History also shows us that sometimes nobility will live among foreign courts, either as hostages or trusted advisors. For example, in the later Roman Empire, some Persian princes were sent as hostages to Constantinople, where they were raised to know Rome's religion, politics, and social structure. In many cases, a wise king might see an opportunity to press the foreign noble's claim to the throne, and in turn secure himself a powerful ally or puppet. I hypothesize that this is likely what happened to enable the spread of Indo-European customs in southern India. Our minds can imagine the possible circumstances for this to happen. Perhaps the young son of a Dravidian chief was sent as a hostage to a Vedic kingdom. The boy was raised among the king's court, coming to learn of the Aryan caste structure and of the Vedic gods through the priest's rituals. That boy would grow up into a young man who would perhaps have ambitions of his own, to usurp the throne of his older brother, to return to his tribe and unite all of the nearby tribes into one powerful kingdom. The possibilities are endless. The Vedic king, seeing an opportunity to spread his culture and to have a powerful lord in his debt, might offer to aid the ambitious foreign noble with troops or gold. I am certain that this happened in southern India, likely multiple times even after the end of the Vedic period. But what does this have to do with the Ramayana, you ask? Like many of our Indo-European epics, I propose that the Ramayana may tell a semi-historical account of the feats of one of our Indo-European ancestors. If I'm correct, then the historic Rama was likely an adventuring Vedic prince who used his charisma, noble spirit, and military prowess to place Dravidian claimants loyal to him on Dravidian thrones. Whether for opportunistic or genuine reasons, these claimants recognized the potential of Indo-European traditions and of possessing Vedic allies. In return for his assistance in their ascension to power, these Dravidian claimants helped to spread the Indo-European caste system and Vedic religion in their lands. Furthermore, it is possible that these new kings even spread Ram's story and promoted the undefeatable warrior prince as a deified hero. Many narrative elements within the Ramayana support this theory. Ram is what we would call an adventurer, a noble denied his claim who wanders in other lands seeking prestige, glory, and possibly new lands of his own. Historically, these adventurers were particularly common among the Turkic and Mongol steppe tribes of the medieval period. These simple pastoralists would leave their old lives behind to conquer vast new realms and forge great dynasties. Given that many waves of our Indo-European ancestors did the exact same thing, it is clear that this conquering ambition is part of living steppe cultures. While Ram is considered the rightful heir to the throne of Ayodhya, and later on in the story returns to the throne, it is possible that this is a later literary invention and that the historical Ram was one of these adventurers. From the narrative, we know that Ram's claim was passed in favor of that of his brother Bharat, the son of the king's favorite wife. This is interesting for mainly two reasons. One, the Rig Veda makes mention of a Bharat tribe, which according to the texts became the most successful of the Aryan tribes in their struggles against the Dashyas. Based on the principles of tribalism, it is likely that the founder of this clan was named Bharat. Second, the two Vedic dynasties fighting for power in the Mahabharata both claim descent from a man named Bharat, who united the Vedic peoples together into a single Aryan kingdom. While the Mahabharata states that this Bharat is a descendant of the lunar dynasty, which suggests a different person entirely, it is possible that this was a later literary invention to separate the Vedic progenitor from the myth of Ram. The modern nation-state of India itself is even called Bharat by Indians. While the Bharat of the Ramayana may have simply shared this name by coincidence, but I seriously doubt that, it is possible that he was the founder of the Bharat dynasty mentioned in the Mahabharata, perhaps even the founder of the Bharat tribe mentioned in the Rig Veda. If this Bharat remained on the throne and united the Vedic people, then it is reasonable to assume that Ram, himself a skilled warrior, would seek the titles and the glory that he had been robbed of elsewhere. As the Ramayana indicates, this adventuring Ram would have ventured south into India's forested interior. Perhaps Ram himself was not one historical person, but represented a common practice where non-inheriting sons of Vedic kings would venture south to fight in Dravidian lands in hopes of spreading their religious traditions and bringing glory to their bloodlines. According to the Ramayana, Ram meets Sugrive, the exiled former king of the Vulneras, in the forest. His throne had been usurped by his scheming brother, and his wife brought into his brother's new harem. These dynastic struggles infuriated the otherwise noble Sugrive, and he would do anything to get his throne back. The exiled Ram would definitely relate to Sugrive, and would be happy to put a king on the throne who is indebted to him. Now, of course, Sugrive and his Vulneras are often described as monkeys, but the term Vulnera itself does not refer to monkeys, instead meaning man of the forest. While having an army of monkeys serve Ram makes the epic all the more fantastic, it is not plausible from a historical perspective. In all likelihood, the Vulneras were probably some confederation of indigenous tribes that inhabited the forests of southern India. While some have proposed that this depiction of the Vulneras as monkeys reflects a racial bias the Aryans had against these people, and as funny as that would be, I don't think that's the case. While most of the Vulneras have been depicted as monkeys since the medieval era, two important advisors to Sugrive include a bear king and an eagle or vulture king. I mean, don't get me wrong, surely monkeys can be used for racial stereotyping. But bears and eagles? I mean, these are often described as proud animals, so it seems unlikely that this was some racist Aryan attempt to label their allies as subhuman. Some retellings of the Ramayana suggest that the Vulnera clans merely bared a flag with a monkey on it. Thanks to modern anthropology, we can reasonably presume that totemism would have been practiced by these forest tribes, as it is practiced today by many of India's remote tribes. Ram's animal army is likely a literary exaggeration of the historical truth. More likely, the members of the adventuring prince's army consisted of tribes who brought with them their totems of monkeys, bears, and eagles. After the final battle in the myth, all of the Vulneras return home to their jungles, chanting Lord Ram and Sita's names and worshipping them as gods. This perhaps reflects the historical conversion of Dravidian armies to the worship of the gods of their Vedic lieges. In time, this would help facilitate the adoption of Vedic gods by most Dravidian peoples in the south of India. With a Dravidian king now in his debt, Ram now had access to a large army which he could use to pursue his ambitions. Lanka fits into this story quite simply. Perhaps the island was home to a Dravidian or other non-Indo-European kingdom that had been particularly problematic in the past for both the Dravidian kingdoms and Vedic kingdoms alike. The Rakshasas are thus a demonic personification of a human culture that our ancestors found quite troublesome. Perhaps the Rakshasas' aversion to Vedic religion, as indicated in the myth by their consumption of Vedic priests, made them a target. Perhaps the truth is more close to the story. Maybe a Lankan king kidnapped the wife of an Aryan adventurer and this led to some great conflict. Believe it or not, a small chain of sandbars connects Sri Lanka to the southern tip of the Indian mainland. For many modern Hindus, This land bridge serves as proof of the earthen bridge built by Ram's army in the story. Whether or not this land feature is man-made is irrelevant for our purposes, as it legitimizes the possibility that a foreign army without sophisticated naval technology could invade Lanka in the early Bronze Age. The end result of the war is the slaying of the dangerous foreign king Ravana. Ravana's brother, Vibhishan, who is himself a literal devotee of Ram, is placed on the throne after the war ends. This could be taken in a historical context to mean that the adventuring prince had found a royal claimant loyal to him that he could place as a puppet on the throne. While this might seem far-fetched, it is interesting that the Sinhalese people who inhabit Sri Lanka today are themselves an Indo-European ethnic group speaking an Indo-European language. Sri Lanka is also home to several populations beside the Sinhalese, who are considered indigenous to the island. Perhaps these people are the descendants of the demonized inhabitants of the ancient Lankan kingdom. Was Ram a historical prince adventuring in the south of India? Did our Indo-European ancestors set up puppet kings and client kingdoms to further the spread of Vedic culture and religion? Were the original inhabitants of Sri Lanka wiped out to set up an Indo-European kingdom on the island? Ultimately, we can never know for sure, but the mythos of our people is clearly trying to tell us something that the archaeological record cannot. As an archaeologist, I must admit that there's little archaeological evidence for this theory of mine. However, as is often the case with archaeology, the absence of evidence does not count as evidence that something is not true. I'll let you in on a little secret. As a general rule in archaeology, wars and battlefields throughout human history surprisingly leave very little trace behind in the archaeological record. We can assume that this is due to material reuse, as well as post-battle funerary practices. Like the ancient Greeks on the shores of Troy, the Vedic people cremated their dead. The Trojans were also considered to merely be a subject of myth, until one archaeologist got lucky and found the ancient walled city. Indeed, the Ramayana and the Iliad and other myths of the Trojan War cycle have a lot in common. This is a topic we shall explore in part 2 of this special episode of the Son of the North podcast on the Ramayana and its Indo-European roots. Once again, my name is Rex, and I am the Son of the North. I thank you for tuning into this broadcast. May the gods bless you and your loved ones in the week to come. Now, go forth, my friends, and make your ancestors proud.